All right, hello everyone, and welcome to class 13 of Philosophy 2020 Critical Thinking. Today we're going to talk about analogies. Remember, this is our unit on inductive argumentation. Analogical arguments are another very common kind of inductive argument. So remember as well, what we're doing in this section is we are going through common types of inductive arguments. And we're learning in each case how to assess them for strength, primarily. We can also talk about cogency a little bit. Now, last class, I did not assign any exercises, or I did not recommend any exercises. However, if you want some more practice, here's all you have to do. Go find some polls. For example, you can go to the website I mentioned, 538. You can also just, if you just go to a major newspaper, you will probably find an article that has to do with some kind of opinion poll that occurred recently. Or if you're listening to the radio or watching TV news, an opinion poll will come up at some point. And then just to get a little bit more practice, go and actually find the report from the poll. Right, there's often a link. You can often go to the website of the group that provided the poll, and you can read more there. So what do you want to be testing out when you do that? Well, remember, whenever you're assessing any kind of survey, you want to be thinking about things like sampling error, confidence level, and methods of collection. And the reason you want to be doing this, of course, is you want to be making sure that the sample group is genuinely representative, that it's large enough. Okay, so that's from 2 classes ago. You also want to make sure, though, that you're interpreting the results in the right way. So that means you need to think about, if we get, the example from last class, 47% of Georgia voters at this time in December 2020 say they're going to vote for John Ossoff. You want to be asking yourself, well, given the margin of error, what's the highest that might be? What's the lowest that might be? And then you also want to be thinking about the confidence level. How likely is this, basically the confidence level is saying, how likely is this that this is a good poll? All right. So again, this can sound like a lot of work, but this is a skill that you can practice when you read the news, and hopefully you do read the news. And I think what you'll find is the more you do this, the easier and quicker it'll get. And mostly what you're just looking for is this a reputable study, or is this the kind of study, in quotation marks, that people with nefarious political agendas, or people who are trying to sell you something, sometimes the same situation, might use. Okay, we also talked about problems like the selection effect. Right, that was that funny shipwreck example that I told you about. All right, so now we are moving on to another type of inductive argument, analogy or analogical argument. Now, you probably already know what an analogy is. You've probably used the word analogy before. You probably talked about it in your high school English classes. At least I hope you did. So you probably already know what an analogy is. There used to be a time when to get into college you had to take an exam called the SAT. Some people still do. I don't remember exactly how West Georgia works. And back in the day, I think until about the mid-2000s, actually a large portion of the verbal section consisted of analyzing analogies. They took that off for some reason that I don't fully understand. So analogies are common in everyday reasoning, first of all. You've probably used them before without realizing it. They are also super common in moral reasoning. They are very common in legal reasoning. So any of you who want to be a lawyer out there, especially in a legal system like the one that obtains in most of the US, with maybe the exception of the state of Louisiana, a common law system based upon the British model, essentially everything you do as a lawyer is analogical reasoning. Because in the United States and Great Britain, or at least in England, a lot of legal argumentation involves saying this case is like that one. It involves referring to what's called precedent. previously settled cases. So analogical reasoning is super common in case reasoning. It's also super common in medical reasoning. So any of you out there who want to go on to become doctors or nurses, any one of you out there who thinks you might ever diagnose anyone or you might ever prescribe medication, you will be using analogical reasoning, as it turns out. Because guess what happens a lot? Now, I'm not a doctor myself, but you know, I have friends who are doctors. I read about medicine. A lot of what doctors do involves saying this situation is like situations I've observed in the past. Even if it doesn't fit an exact model of a diagnosis, it's likely that in this comparable situation, this one medicine, this one drug worked. In this situation, this other medicine, this other drug will work. In short, what is analogy? It is the act of making a comparison between two dissimilar things in order to draw conclusions about one of them. So you're saying this is like that, A is like B, and you're saying that in order to try to prove something or infer something new about B. So it's not just a comparison, it has a logical function, an argumentative function. Hence that logi, that's the logic part of it, right? Analogical. Now, I should point out, of course, that we don't always use comparisons between dissimilar things in order to make arguments. There can be an illustrative, think back to the non-argument versus argument section of the course in Unit 1. You can use analogies to illustrate something. A lot of teachers, a lot of professors use analogies. It's an easy way to get students to remember something, first of all. And second of all, analogies in the classroom are often used to get you all to think of what you already know, what you already are familiar with, and draw comparisons between that and what you are less familiar with. So I'm wondering if any of your professors have ever done this for you. Have you encountered any illustrative or elucidative analogies in the classroom? Analogies are not meant to prove anything, but are meant to help you think through a new or a strange concept. You have encountered this, by the way. And if any of you want to go on and be teachers, you should pay attention to the analogies your professors use. And since basically anything you can ever do in your life, any kind of career you ever have in life, will probably involve you teaching someone something at some point, and learning how to use analogies for pedagogical purposes is very helpful, even if you don't intend to become a teacher or a college professor. Okay, so an analogy that I have sometimes used in the past, I don't know if I've used it this round in this course, but sometimes I say, an argument is like a chair. Just as, that's usually a good indication that an analogy is about to spring up, just as a chair has parts, it has legs, and the legs provide support for a seat, and the legs can support the seat well or poorly, so too an argument has parts. And the argument has supports, so to speak, metaphorically, right? It doesn't have supports in the same way the chair has supports. It has a different kind of support, logical rather than physical. And those logical supports are called premises, so they're like the legs of a chair. And they support the conclusion, which is like the seat of the chair, and they can do so well or poorly. Now, I am not literally saying here that a chair is identical to an argument. I'm just saying something that you're talking about something you're familiar with, chairs, in order to get you to think about something that you are probably less familiar with, the formal analysis of argumentation. Okay, so that's one example. Here are a few other examples of analogies. I think yoga is actually an interesting case. I don't know how many of you have ever done any yoga. It's a good thing to do during quarantine. You can just go on YouTube, keep yourself a little relaxed. If you've ever done any yoga, you will notice that all the moves are comparisons, right? So you're essentially, you have, for example, downward facing dog. You're trying to figure out how to hold your body, and you compare yourself to a dog that is stretching. Forrest Gump's mother. I hope you've seen this movie, very famous movie from a few decades ago. Forrest Gump's mother says, well, I'll leave it to you to figure that one out if you don't know it. It's something about a box of chocolates, remember that. In a neuroscience or a cognitive science or psychology class, your professors might use a comparison between a brain and a computer. In order, not to say that the brain is identical to a computer, but in order to help you see and understand features of the brain that you might not have been familiar with before. And so on and so forth. Famous philosopher of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, compares speaking a language to playing a game. Not exactly the same. He talks about language games, but you think about a game, it has rules, has certain moves. The rules don't just exist to tell you what you can and cannot do, but also they open up new kinds of moves that you couldn't have done before those rules, right? It doesn't make sense to talk about, I don't know, scoring a touchdown outside the context of a football game. And similarly, within the game of language or particular language games, maybe new kinds of moves or actions become possible, like swearing or insulting someone. Okay, so we're not saying language is exactly identical to football, but there's a similarity there. All right. Now, I'm just giving you these examples because I want you to see that there is a non-argumentative use of analogies. This is like that in order to help you understand a little bit better something that's unfamiliar. The argumentative use of analogy, then more precisely, we could call it analogical argument. And an analogical argument, you are again trying to establish or prove a conclusion. And you are doing so by comparing two non-identical things and saying that they are like each other in an important way. So some important terms then to keep in mind. One term is analog. We're going to, we use these terms just to have more sophisticated precision for talking about parts. Just as with arguments, we can talk about premises and conclusions. In an analogical argument, we can talk about analogs. The analogs are the different items being compared. You can have two analogs. That's the simplest kind of analogical argument. So if you say the brain is like a computer, we're saying that the brain and the computer are analogs. Right? This is not, forget by the way about the word analog in the sense of analog clock. That's not what we're talking about here. So the two things that are being compared are analogs. If there are more than two, that's fine. Some analogical arguments turn on a whole lot more than two analogs. The other point is that the other term is disanalogy. And with disanalogy, we're saying that there's the opposite of an analogy. Now, there's always going to be a disanalogy. If you compare two non-identical things, they're always going to be different in some respect. So there's always going to be a disanalogy between them. However, that's not terribly interesting because anyone who is at all adept at making analogical arguments knows this. You say the brain is like a computer, you can also say the brain is not like a computer. So if you want to refute an analogical argument, you have to show that there is a relevant disanalogy. We'll talk more about how to do that down the road. So when you're hearing analogical arguments, you want to be thinking, what's the conclusion? That's always where you want to start. What are the analogs? And are there any relevant or significant disanalogies? Okay, I always like to include these warm-up exercises. Again, as you're watching these videos, I encourage you to pause frequently, think through what I'm saying on your own, write down your own examples. You should be actively taking notes while you watch these videos. Imagine it's like a classroom. So pause the video now and make a list of a few analogies you've encountered before. And if you want, feel free to share them on the general discussion board. All right, so I want to give you just a few illustrations of the practical ways in which analogical argument can be used. Again, one very commonplace domain in which analogical argument is used is the law. And if you want to go off and be a lawyer, you're going to have to get pretty adept at making analogical arguments and analyzing them. Even if you don't want to be a lawyer, any educated person should try to understand the significant Supreme Court decisions that have happened in our country. And so you can actually go, I mean, this is amazing. You can just go online. I think I have a link in the notes section of this. So when I post the PowerPoint, you can click on the link. You can just go online and you can read Supreme Court decisions. If you read a Supreme Court decision, by the way, just so that you understand what you're reading, there will often be what's called an opinion, which is actually an argument. Okay, I want to be clear about that. So in the case of the Supreme Court, what's called an opinion is actually an argument. Again, this is why I highly discourage you all from using the word opinion in this class. It's highly ambiguous. And what typically happens is, of course, at the present, it wasn't always this way, but at present there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. They vote. The winning majority gets the task of writing what's called the majority opinion, which not only explains the decision, but also justifies it, gives an argument for it. However, and this is kind of cool, if there's not a unanimous vote, people who don't agree with the majority opinion are free to write dissenting opinions. In other words, counter arguments. All right, so this is a case, this particular example is a case that is used a lot in kind of basic discussions of legal reasoning. You can find a lot of legal reasoning textbooks. I've taught it when I teach philosophy of law before. Katz versus United States, 1967. It's a really significant case in privacy litigation. Essentially what happened in this case was the FBI wiretapped a public phone booth without a warrant, obtained some information about, I think it was maybe like illegal interstate gambling or drug trafficking or something of that sort. And the person that they were wiretapping took them to court and said, you didn't have the right to wiretap this public payphone without a warrant. So this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was a landmark case in, again, the sphere of privacy law. Hugely relevant today, of course, for thinking about things like government surveillance of the internet. So the majority actually ruled in this case that the FBI had acted improperly, that it should have obtained a warrant from a judge before wiretapping that payphone. Right, and typically to obtain a warrant, you have to show some kind of evidence of wrongdoing. But Justice Black, who's an interesting figure actually on the Supreme Court, he wrote important dissents on a lot of very significant decisions. So again, if you take a legal reasoning class, you end up reading a lot of his opinions. This is a really, really crude paraphrase on my part of his reasoning. But basically, the question was, what is wiretapping a public phone booth like? Because again, in the American legal system, we've got statutes passed by Congress, we've got the Constitution, but another source of law, as the saying goes, is precedent. So you have to look to previous cases. So the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, gives you some protection against warrantless searches and seizures. So we have a kind of paradigm case of where the government's not supposed to come into your house without a warrant, right? So entering your home to search your home. However, on the other hand, as Justice Black points out, at the other extreme, a police officer, we typically think, would not need a warrant if she, say, happens to overhear a criminal conversation in public. If you're standing on a street corner and you have 2 people arguing out loud nearby, and one of them is saying, you didn't give me my payout from the diamond heist, and the other one is saying, yes, I did. It's perfectly legitimate in that case for the officer to take that information without a warrant. And so Justice Black was saying, which is wiretapping more like? And essentially Justice Black said, wiretapping is like eavesdropping. Whereas the majority opinion said wiretapping is more like entering a home. And Black argued, just as with eavesdropping, which was a practice known at the time of the founding of the United States. Eavesdropping, if you don't know what that is, by the way, is standing outside someone's home and listening under the eaves, listening in through the window. He says, just as eavesdropping doesn't need a warrant, at least not at that time, apparently, so too should wiretapping, which is not significantly different. In a public place in particular, maybe sneaking up to someone's home is one thing, Justice Black says, but wiretapping a public payphone is like just hiding in public and listening to conversations happening in a public square. And since listening in on conversations happening in public is not problematic and doesn't require a warrant. Here's the conclusion. So too should we not require officers to obtain a warrant to wiretap public payphones. Now again, this was not the majority opinion. This was not the opinion of the court, but here's an argument. And again, the conclusion to this argument is police officers should not be required to obtain a warrant to wiretap public payphones. So you can see how this kind of reasoning works. And again, I've given actually a rather simplistic and reductive version of Justice Black's argument. So if you want to go and read the whole thing yourself, I encourage you to do so. Again, a lot of what the Supreme Court does is this kind of reasoning, and other courts as well. Here's a more formal representation of analogical argument. Remember, again, we've talked about formally representing arguments or extracting argument forms. And when we do that, we're just coming up with a kind of algebraic pattern to stand in for a whole class, a whole variety of arguments that all have the same type. So the important point is, in an analogical argument, you're always trying to prove something about one of the analogs. You're always trying to say one particular analog has some feature or some property, some aspect that we didn't previously recognize. And to do that, you're saying that one analog, in this case y is probably z, or y has the property of z. You're saying y is relevantly similar to something that we do understand better. And when I say relevantly similar, I mean shares some relevant, important features. So that can be, we can compare the analog that's in our conclusion with one analog or with multiple analogs. That's what premise 1 is doing there. So premise 1, again, it could be x is, if we have just one analog, x is p, q, and r. So we're saying x has the properties p, q, and r. We're saying y has the properties p, q, and r. We know this. These are the respects in which they're similar. However, x has an additional property, z. We don't know that y has the property z, but given the similarity between the two analogs, it seems reasonable to conclude that y also has the property z. And again, you can make this as strong as you like by comparing y to x, w, r, and s, and not just x. Okay, so going back to that wiretapping example, we could substitute for x listening to conversations in public. And we could say listening to conversations in public by a police officer has the effect, has the property P of collecting information in public, of being in public, of potentially being useful for the solving of crimes. And Y would be wiretapping a public phone booth. Also an action that occurs in public, potentially useful for the solving of crimes, etc., etc. We say that listening to public conversations is something that can happen without a warrant. So Z is something that may legally happen without a warrant. Therefore, we infer that wiretapping a public payphone is something that may legally happen without a warrant. Now again, this is not what the Supreme Court ruled. This is Justice Black's dissent. So again, with any kind of formal representation of argument, you could substitute all sorts of other terms, other analogs, and other properties for these letters. Now, so far, I have tried to give you prima facie reasonable analogical arguments, but these are going to be controversial. By the way, for those of you who are doing the project on abortion, one of the 4 topics you can choose, a lot of arguments about abortion turn on analogies. If you read Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous article, which you'll have to if you're doing that track, A Defense of Abortion, is a very famous, or infamous perhaps, analogy. Thompson says that the situation of the person contemplating an abortion is analogous, that's the adjective, analogous to the situation of someone who is involuntarily hooked up to a famous person by their kidneys and being asked to sustain that person, give them life support through the use of their kidneys. And if that sounds a little bit outlandish, and maybe less outlandish formulation of this is to say, this is a more recent take on Thompson's basic argument, that the moral status of abortion should be thought about as being similar to, analogous to, the moral problems surrounding kidney donation. Okay, so that's a pro-choice argument, by the way. On the other side of the spectrum, some philosophers have argued that having an abortion is analogous to drinking while pregnant. Right? I'll let you fill in the rest of the steps here in these arguments. On the one case, the sense is that carrying a fetus to term might be, forcing someone to carry a fetus to term against her will might be morally similar to forcing someone to engage in organ donation, give up the use of one of her organs to someone else. On the other side of the spectrum, we have an analogy between the act of abortion and the potential moral wrongs associated with that, and the kinds of harms that can be inflicted from drinking while pregnant. So this is just to show you that there are going to be some cut and dried analogies, but there are going to be some more controversial ones. And to help you understand where analogies can go wrong, I've given you a very obviously weak analogical argument. So I don't know why I wrote A instead of P. That should be P there. Premise 1, innocent people are killed every year in car accidents. Oh, that's the first analog. Okay. Premise 2, some innocent people may also be killed by government execution, but no one holds that we should ban cars. Similarly, we should not conclude that capital punishment should be banned. All right, so I think it's pretty clear this is a bad argument, although unfortunately I still hear people say this kind of argument sometimes, or variations on it. You know, I've heard people say before, why do we get so worked up about terrorist attacks? Traffic accidents kill far more people every year, which is true. I mean, by several orders of magnitude. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So in this example, you want to start by saying, what's the conclusion? Then you want to try to figure out what the analogs are. And you want to try to map it out. What are the two terms being compared? In what respect are they said to be similar? And what's the specific property that we are inferring about the analog in the conclusion? Pause the video and try to figure that out. All right. So the conclusion is we should not get rid of capital punishment. In other words, we should not get rid of the death penalty. Now, there are various ways to make that argument, by the way. There are much better ways to make that argument if you want to make that argument. What is the argument here? The argument is analogical. So we should not get rid of the death penalty. And why not? Well, the first analog is innocent people. And innocent people killed in car accidents in particular. And the second analog is innocent people killed by government execution. All right, so we have these two analogs, innocent people killed in car accidents, innocent people killed by government execution. These are similar. They're also different. That's always going to be the case with analogical arguments. So you don't do yourself any favor here by saying they're different. You want to say how they're different and why it matters. Let's start by saying how they're similar. The obvious similarity between these two is that they both involve innocent people. So what is the property that innocent people killed every year in car accidents and innocent people killed every year by government execution have in common? They have actually two properties in common here. Number one, the property of innocence. Number two, the property of being killed. So why is this not a strong analogical argument? Well, it's because there is a significant disanalogy. It's not just that there's a difference, but there's a significant disanalogy. And what's the disanalogy? Well, the one case involves unintentional killings, at least for the most part. I would hazard a guess, without knowing the statistics off the top of my head, that most people who die in car accidents are not intentionally killed by other people. Hence the name accident. However, people killed by the government, that's a case of intentional killing. When the government executes you, whether it's the state or the federal government, that is an intended action. Someone or some group of people with legal sanction, to be sure, form the intention, we're going to kill you, and then they do so. So that's one very significant disanalogy. Why is it significant? Because there seems to be an underlying moral difference between intentional and unintentional killing. We could try to explain this further, but I think most people have a sense that there's something morally different between accidentally killing someone and intentionally killing them. And our law reflects this, right? In the law, we have a whole range of types of homicide, right? There's a difference between first-degree murder, which involves premeditation usually, and negligent manslaughter, where you kill someone accidentally, but you should have taken appropriate precautions not to. Those get different jail sentences typically. Okay, so there's a really, really important, not just a difference, but an important, relevant to the conclusion kind of difference. Because this is a moral inquiry here, there is a difference that has to do with the basic moral principle. By the way, if you wanted a different direction you could take this would be to say, also, in addition, there might be something significantly disanalogous between killings that are caused by ordinary individual citizens, private killings, if you will, and killings that are carried out by organized public power, public or government killings, state killings as well. Okay, so why did I just belabor that point? I just spent 7 minutes talking about that argument, which is patently, obviously bad. The reason I did that is because, well, here's what I'm guessing. Again, we're not in a classroom now. I can't hear you, I can't ask you, but if I had asked you, I think a lot of you you've got an intuitive grasp of an analogical argument. So intuitively, that is kind of immediately, you can be like, no, those are two different. That's not a good comparison. And with a silly example like the one I just gave you, that's going to work fine. But in more controversial cases, you want to be able to explain your intuition. You want to be able to identify the relevant disanalogy. If you don't, here's what's going to happen. You're going to say, I don't think those two analogs are relevantly similar, and your opponent is going to say, I think they are. And it's just going to turn into a yes, no, back and forth without any rational resolution. So the way that you progress the inquiry is by identifying the disanalogy very precisely, using the model I just gave you. And this is the important point then. If you want to object to or refute an analogical argument, it does not suffice to show that the two analogs are different. You must show that their difference matters. All right, so what I'm going to talk about now are 6 tests of analogical arguments. But before I do that, a meta point. As I said at the beginning of this unit, when it comes to inductive argument, sometimes reasonable people disagree. There's no algorithm, there's no foolproof procedure that will tell you this analogical argument is strong, this one is weak. That doesn't mean that this is entirely subjective, though. So there are going to be some analogical arguments that are obviously strong. There are going to be some analogical arguments that are obviously weak, and there are going to be some analogical arguments that are in the middle, more controversial. What I'm expecting of you, in other words, is not that you magically come to an agreement with me about which of these arguments are strong or weak. What I'm expecting of you rather is, as math teachers say, that you show your work. You justify your assessment one way or another. So again, feel free to disagree with one another. Reasonable people, there's room for disagreement between reasonable people, but what makes you different as a reasonable person from someone who's not is that you try to back up your assessment of an analogy using these 6 tests. I can't stress this enough, by the way, because every time I teach this class, there's always a portion of an exam or an assignment where I say, evaluate this analogy, and a sizable chunk of students will go in and say, this is a bad analogy because the 2 analogs are different. And they leave it at that. If you do that, you're basically going to get a 0 on the assignment. That's very intellectually lazy. You got to make an effort to think through and state out loud, make explicit how they're different and why it matters. So here are 6 tests, and I should be clear, these are not in any specific order. In some cases, some of these tests matter more than others. So this is an art. This is not this is not an algorithm, it's an art. And in a way, it's kind of like diagnosing a complicated condition or disease. First off, just after you've identified the analogs, how relevant are the similarities between the analogs? And how many similarities are there? When I say relevant, I guess what I mean is that sometimes different properties don't go together with one another. When I went off to college, here's an example. When I went off to college, I left my home state of New Jersey. And, maybe you had this experience too in college. People kind of wanted to connect me up with people they knew. And so sometimes what would happen is people where I went to college would say, oh, hey, I've got this friend from New Jersey. You should go meet them. So the problem here is that we both, me and Joe Schmo, we both have the property of being from New Jersey, having been born and grown up in New Jersey. However, as you probably are aware, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have a whole lot else in common, that we're going to like each other. The property of, say, being from New Jersey is not deeply linked to the property of, say, being interested in studying philosophy, something that happens to have been rather important in my life. So how relevant are the similarities between the analogs, and how similar are they? Forrest Gump's mother says to him, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So that's one similarity between the two of them. You never know what you're going to get in life or in a box of chocolates. But, there are a lot of differences between life and a box of chocolates, too. Not to be a total pedant here, right? But, life is not made out of chocolate. What are the disanalogies? What are the differences, and how intense are they? Now, this is difficult, of course, because with any two different things, you could potentially point out an infinite number of differences between them. Here I am sitting at my dining room table. I've got two coasters that my parents gave me. They're both made out of wood, but there are a lot of differences between them. One has the property of being held in my right hand. One has the property of being held in my left hand. And I could get more specific. I could say one is located at precisely this latitude and this longitude, one at this latitude and this longitude, and so on and so forth. I could list an infinite number of differences between just these two wooden coasters. So you want to be thinking about interesting or important disanalogies. How many primary analogs are there? The primary analogs are the ones that we know more about, whereas the other analogs are the ones we're trying to infer something about. How diverse are the primary analogs? And how specific is the conclusion? That's really important. Because often at a very general level, you can say, for example, the brain is like a computer. Both are capable of problem solving. That's a very general, almost vapid conclusion. The brain is like a computer. Both are capable of problem solving. So the relevant property they have is problem solving. However, if we get more specific about the nature of problem solving, there are potentially a number of other things out there that have that capacity, right? Most animals can probably problem solve to a certain extent. Okay, maybe even your thermostat can if it's a more modern one. So as you get more precise, more specific, human beings are capable of moral problem solving. Well, now we're more specific about what we're talking about. Okay, so the more specific the conclusion, the more interesting the argument is going to be, but it's going to be harder to prove. All right, so as always, I believe in just going through this topic with examples. And I'm going to give you a hard example here. I admit this is hard. But this is a philosophy class, and philosophy is a hard subject, and I thought using a philosophical example might also interest some of you, pique your curiosity about philosophy. This is from a book by someone named David Hume. If you had to make a list of the most famous European philosophers, most important European philosophers since the 1600s, Hume would probably be somewhere in the top 3 or 4. Hume was an atheist, actually, which was rather unusual in the 18th century, even in Scotland. which was a place of a major place in the European Enlightenment of that century. Hume was an atheist, so he actually didn't even dare to publish this book until after he died. He died in, I think in 1775, and his friends published this book. The year of the American Revolution. 1776 was also an interesting year for philosophy. I believe it was also the year that Hume's buddy Adam Smith published Wealth of Nations. Alright, so this is a book about essentially arguments for the existence of God. And if you take my philosophy class, we talk about some of these. Very, very common argument for the existence of God is called the design argument. You are probably familiar with it if you've ever thought about religion reflectively. You've probably encountered it before. People who believe in intelligent design today subscribe to this argument. Little do they know that even prior to Darwin, our friend here, David Hume, refuted the argument, almost 300 years ago. So here's how it goes. It's a dialogue, so there are different characters talking to each other. This is the Cleanthes character who believes the design argument is a good argument. Pay attention. Look around the world. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, which again admit of subdivisions to a degree beyond what human sense and faculties can trace and explain. All these various machines, and even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. Oh, to be in the 18th century when we could talk like that again. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds the productions of human contrivance, of human design, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Since therefore the effects resemble each other, we are led to infer, by all the rules of analogy, there you go, analogy, that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties proportioned to the grandeur of the work which he has executed. Boom. That's the design argument. And if you don't understand that, let me put that in 21st century English for you, because I know some of you may not be accustomed to reading things from the 18th century. Essentially what Hume is saying is the universe is like a complex machine. We can compare it to machines that human beings made. And just as, machines made by human beings have certain properties, and we infer from those properties back to an intelligent designer. We think you can't get a clock without intelligence, right? There's a difference between a clock and a clump of moss or a pile of leaves on the ground. So too must we infer that the cause of the universe is intelligent, an intelligent designer, aka God. Now, some of you maybe think that this is a good argument. Some of you may think this is a terrible argument. Darwin at least gave us a compelling alternative explanation of design in the universe, right? So, if you are familiar with the theory of evolution, which of course is a rigorous scientific theory and not merely a hypothesis, unlike some of what its misinformed detractors think, Darwin essentially says you can get phenomena that seem as though they are designed simply by a process called evolution by natural selection. And Darwin basically said, what I mean by that is a process of variation of traits, a process of environmental selection whereby some living beings with those traits die out and some survive, and a process of heredity whereby those who survive pass on their traits to the next generation. And Darwin said if you have that, if you have those three features, and you have an additional fourth feature, which is a whole lot of time, millions, billions of years, you can get outcomes that look as though they were designed by an intelligent designer. All right, so you can kind of see what's at stake here. Let's lay this out more carefully, though. Rather than just relying on our intuition, let's lay this out. So what we're saying is the world, or the universe really, is like a large machine. So large machine, that is the primary analog. That's in P1 down there. The world is like a large machine. And in what respects are they like each other? Well, this is my reconstruction of the argument, so I could get into more detail here, but basically Cleanthes in this text says they're both subdivided into many parts, and that's pretty uncontroversial. The universe has many parts to it, machines do. right? I mean, it could be something like an iPhone, which has all sorts of little chips in it, glass, or it could be, I mean, again, if it's the 18th century, we're thinking like mechanical watches, right? A lot of little gears turning around. Think of a bicycle, maybe. Many parts. And second point is the parts are adjusted to each other. In other words, the parts are able to function together. They have a kind of functional organization. The parts are able to work together to, or as Cleanthes put it, are adjusted to each other in a way that such that the parts are adapted to the carrying out of certain ends. In a machine, for example, like a clock or a bicycle, the gears, the wheels, the chain, all of it's fitted together so that the bike overall functions and allows you to ride it. You can carry out a certain kind of task. And Cleanthes says the universe is like that too. The parts of the universe all fit together. Maybe a little bit of a harder claim to accept, but at the very least we know that the universe seems to persist in time. The world seems to persist in time. Living beings flourish and multiply. We don't all just start floating up into the sky into outer space. Matter just doesn't disintegrate, right? So there's a kind of functional, harmonious integration of parts, right? So those are properties P and Q. So we're saying X is P, Q, and R. And what is the R here? R is the property of having been designed by something, a being with wisdom and intelligence. The property of having an intelligent designer. A bicycle doesn't arise out of thin air. Doesn't arise by accident. It's created by humans. Maybe not just one anymore, but human beings, a collaborative process where there's intelligence and foresight. There's planning, maybe a blueprint. You follow certain kinds of procedures to make the bike, to test it, and so on. So, premise 1, X is P, Q, and R. Large machines are subdivided into many parts, P. They are adjusted to one another, and they are intelligently designed by a being with intelligence and wisdom. Premise 2, the universe is subdivided into many parts, and the parts are adjusted to each other functionally. Therefore, the universe is also probably designed by a being with intelligence and wisdom. This is the design argument, a very old argument that got revived a few decades ago by the intelligent design folks, but it's much older than that. And as you're about to see, people from centuries ago were also aware of how you argue against this, even before Darwin came along. A lot of reasonable people thought this was a pretty weak argument. So it seems, the best we can say here, since this is an inductive argument, by the way, is that the universe probably has an intelligent designer, right? The premises make the conclusion likely, not necessary. Again, if you take my philosophy 2010 class, Intro to Philosophy, there are attempts at deductive arguments for the existence of God. This is not one. This is an inductive argument for the existence of God. All right. So I'm not gonna use all 6 tests. The 6 tests I gave for analogical arguments. I'm gonna focus on 3. These are the 3 that I typically suggest you focus on. The others are really you should really only use them in very tough cases or in cases that involve multiple primary analogs. But since Hurley goes over all 6, I wanted to mention all 6. So how relevant are the similarities between the analogs? What's the nature and degree of disanalogy, and how specific is the conclusion? So test 1, relevance of the similarities. What are we asking here? Well, we're saying, are these different properties related to each other? Do they necessarily go along with each other, or are they even likely related to each other? Remember back to my example about going off to college and being told, here's someone you might like from New Jersey. Just as you're from New Jersey and you like philosophy, so too is Joe Schmo from New Jersey, and Joe Schmo likes philosophy. But being from New Jersey is not, the property of being from New Jersey is not in any profound way linked to the property of being interested in philosophy. So we want relevant properties. Properties that tend to go along with one another. Right? When you're say thinking about a medication and you're comparing it to its generic, you might start thinking about the different properties that the medication and its generic have, And those different properties are probably deeply integrally related to one another. So the three properties in question in the primary analog are being subdivided into many parts, having parts that are mutually adjusted to each other or functionally cooperate, and being designed by a being that is wise and intelligent. Now, these three properties are clearly related. They're not accidentally related, in other words. Properties P and Q are necessary. You can't have property Q without having property P. You can have property P without having property Q, of course. You could think of an entity, a being that has many parts, but whose parts are not functionally organized in any specific way. An example of that would be, say, a bowl of popped popcorn. When I think about a bowl of popped popcorn, many little parts, many little pieces of popcorn, but the parts aren't really organized together like a machine. They're not organized together to be able to carry out any specific task. So you can have P without Q, but if you have Q, by definition, you have P, because if you have functionally coordinated parts, then you have to have parts. So there's some relationship between P and Q. In other words, many beings that have properties P will have property Q, and vice versa. Although not all. Not all beings with property P will have property Q. However, and again, you might say in many cases, beings with both properties P and Q will be likely to have property R as well. Many things out there that have parts that are functionally coordinated with each other are also the product of intelligent design and craftsmanship, right? So watches, bicycles, cars, basically all these artifacts, all, as people used to say, man-made objects, complex tools, are going to satisfy the bill. The problem is that not everything with properties P and Q will have property R. So here we can start really pushing back. If we can just come up with a list of other things out there, other types of beings that are both divided into parts and have functionally coordinated parts, but do not have intelligent designers, then we show that there's no necessary connection with having an intelligent designer, and therefore that we are not licensed to conclude that the universe has an intelligent designer. So that's your task. I want you to pause the video before going to the next slide. Can you think of any counterexamples? This is not counterexample in a technical sense from the first unit. I'm just asking you to think of examples of beings that have properties P and Q, but not property R. And actually here, I'm not going to give you any answers. You have to think about this on your own. However, you might maybe potentially think about certain kinds of solids, like crystals. You might potentially think about, another way to go would be to think about the level of coordination exhibited in free market economies without intentional planning. So you can get creative here. Effectively, what you are doing with the first test is you are transforming the argument into a categorical proposition of the following sort. All beings that have parts which are functionally coordinated are beings that have intelligent designers. The universe is a being, blah, 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 therefore the universe is a being, is the kind of thing that has an intelligent designer. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to disprove the first premise in that argument. That's essentially the strategy for the first test. The second test. So here now is Philo. So Hume wrote this book as a dialogue, so it's basically a debate between different characters. So Cleanthes, again, is the one who thinks that the design argument is a good one, a strong one. Here's Philo's objection. And this is the nature and degree of disanalogy test, or test 3. Philo says, if we see a house, Cleanthes, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had an architect or builder, because this is precisely that species, that kind of effect, which we have experienced to proceed from the species of cause. But surely you will not affirm, you will not assert, that the universe bears such a resemblance to a house that we can with the same certainty infer a similar cause, or that the analogy is here perfect, entire and perfect. The dissimilitude, the disanalogy, is so striking that the utmost you can here pretend to is a guess, a conjecture, a presumption concerning a similar cause. How that pretension will be perceived in the world, I leave you to consider. In other words, what Philo is saying is, hey buddy, you don't really have an argument, you just have a guess. There's a difference between having a conclusion that's backed up by an argument and a conclusion based on a guess. Just as there's a difference between knowing the correct answer on the test and making a lucky guess and getting it right. And why is Philo saying this? Well, Philo is saying that the universe and human-made complex machines are really actually quite different from one another. How so? Well, most obviously, the universe is a lot bigger. But Philo actually points out a difference maybe you hadn't considered, which is that we human beings, when we consider artifacts like your smartphone or this coaster I have here on my desk, this lamp I have over here, a mechanical watch, we human beings don't have to guess that these are made by an intelligent designer. We can actually experience this. We can do it ourselves, and we can watch other people do it. Now, you don't necessarily want to, I doubt very many of you have actually gone off to an iPhone factory, but in principle, you could experience it. Whereas nothing of the sort can be said about the universe. There's no way to experience the universe being designed and created. So that's a pretty significant difference, a pretty significant disanalogy. And it has to do with our mode of verifying the claim. We can't possibly verify the claim in the same way that we can verify that the products of human art, craftsmanship, and technology are made by intelligent designers, namely us. All right, so this slide just reiterates what I said in the previous slide. The problem here is really, so you're going to see here when we test analogical arguments out, we're basically applying all the tools we've learned up to this point. So the problem essentially is that since we can't actually experience the universe being created, we can only guess that it was created by an intelligent designer. And we do so, basically what Philo is saying here is we're doing so on the basis of something like an enumerative induction. We've seen a lot of artifacts, a lot of complex machines with interlocking parts, and we've noticed that they all seem to have the property of being created by an intelligent designer, so we conclude essentially that all such machines are created by an intelligent designer. But that's potentially a pretty weak induction here, given the other disanalogy between the universe and a complex machine, which is the universe is so much more vast. It's the sum total of everything that is. How can you compare the sum total of all that which is, everything that is, to one particular thing within that sum total? Again, if you hate this, by the way, maybe, I get that, but if you like these kinds of discussions here, take my Intro to Philosophy class, and we talk about these kinds of problems a lot more. So far, the argument is on shaky ground. We've said that there's potentially a problem with the relevance of the different properties to one another, the relevance of the similarities to one another. There are major disanalogies that are being overlooked. And finally, and I think this is the real, at least Hume, I think, believe this to be the real knockdown argument, the specificity of the conclusion. So this, by the way, is usually the place where you can trip an analogical argument up. That's why I saved it for last, test 6. So here's Philo again. In a word, Cleanthes, someone who follows your hypothesis is able perhaps to assert or conjecture that the universe sometime arose from something like design. What is Philo doing here? It's a classic move, one that I hope you master in this course. If you want to argue against someone's argument, the hands down best way to do that, or one of the best ways, is to accept most of it and then show it doesn't prove what they want to show. Right? This is a way more effective strategy than just coming out yelling and shouting or disagreeing with someone. You just say, I concede your argument, but here's why you still don't get what you want. So, all that your argument proves, Cleanthes, then, is this. Coming back to the quote, it shows that the universe sometime arose from something like design. But beyond that position, someone who holds this view cannot ascertain one single circumstance. There you go. So what Philo is saying is, all that you can conclude from your argument is that the universe may have arisen from intelligent design. But we don't know anything about the design process or anything about the designer from that argument. So let me continue. This world, for aught we know, is very faulty and imperfect compared to a superior standard, and was only the first rude essay, in other words, first crude attempt of some infant deity who afterwards abandoned it ashamed of his lame performance. It is the work only of some dependent inferior deity, and is the object of derision to his superiors. It is the production of old age and dotage in some superannuated deity, and ever since his death he has run on at adventures from the first pulse and active force which it received from him. All right, yeah, and if you've ever seen the TV show The Good Place, that's almost like a dramatic dramatization of this point. Not to spoil anything about that show, which is an excellent show, and I've actually met some of the philosophy professors who helped collaborate on it. So what's going on here? Well, essentially Hume is saying is, all right, let's think about what your argument actually proves. Your argument, if we concede a lot of ground, if I just overlook everything I've already said, proves at best that the universe, or makes probable that the universe has a designer. But for all we know, that designer could be just one god among many. Maybe it was a child god, like, when you're like, you have a child, and the child, say, I don't know, comes home from school with some sort of crude arts and crafts project, and you clap and you go, yay, good job, and you put it in storage and try to forget about it, and try not to let that abomination adorn your household, right? Maybe that's what this is, just some like crude childish attempts, and maybe the designer of the universe is now ashamed of what it did. Maybe it was like the bottom of the bureaucracy. It's like, when you go to the DMV and you like the lowest ranking person there created the universe, and then someone complained about it to the upper echelon of the DMV, and the upper echelon was like, oh, we didn't realize that happened, sorry, but you'll have to fill out this paperwork if you want to get a better universe, or maybe this is a constant, Hume says, an object of derision, right? Maybe some really old powerful being created the universe and then just died and never bothered to finish it, and it's just been running on ever since. In other words, I think what Hume is pointing out here, first of all, is that the conclusion is not specific enough. The Cleanthes wants to get the Christian God out of this picture, and he can't get the Christian God. All he can get is designer, not anything about the designer. And also, I think Hume, or Philo, the Philo character, kind of tongue-in-cheek, is pointing out that although the machines we create are indeed created by intelligent beings, we're not perfectly intelligent. We are actually, as it turns out, quite stupid in some ways as well. We are clumsy, we are careless, we are selfish and egotistical. We have some foresight, but not perfect foresight. We overlook obvious design problems in the products we make, and that's why, I gotta call up Hyundai and get my car inspected on a recall because some part in it isn't working properly and my car might catch fire, etc., etc. The analogy doesn't prove what Cleanthes wants it to prove. All right, so I've talked about why this argument, which seems like at first glance like a strong inductive argument for the existence of God, turns out to be a rather weak inductive argument for the existence of God. Which isn't to say, of course, that there aren't other ways to try to prove the existence of God. Philosophers in various traditions, from Hinduism to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have been trying for thousands of years to prove the existence of God. And I think today, those who still believe that's a worthwhile enterprise, and there are some, and you can read more about them on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I think almost none of them go for the design argument. So that's one point. And I think Philo helps us see here why the apparent analogy ends up being only a very weak one. The deeper point, of course, is that today we have several models of how something that seems to have been designed, something with apparent order of design, can arise from non-intelligent processes. So again, modern economics, you could think about the early study of free market economies that Hume's friend and contemporary Adam Smith was developing that would become the basis for modern economics, which tells us, or at least asserts, I don't want to exaggerate how scientific economics is, but modern economics asserts that we can explain features of our economic system that seem to have been designed, like price stability or price determination, from the kind of aggregate net equilibrium effect of dozens of, millions of different actors acting without any kind of central plan or coordination. And similarly, Darwin in biology and computer science differently have given us lots of models of thinking about how seemingly designed products can arise through non-intelligent processes. Right? There's some really important kind of computer simulations that show how with simple algorithms, mindless algorithms, you can get what look like very, very complex intentional design behavior. You can, some of the biologists who study the origins of life, for example, write computer programs that try to simulate what the origins of life out of non-living matter might have, how that might have occurred. All right, so the analogy falls apart. If you are curious, by the way, about the specific topics I talked about today to illustrate analogical argument, there's a link right there to Hume's book. You can read the whole thing. It's in the public domain since it was written so long ago. And as for the larger point about how seemingly designed phenomena can arise out of mindless processes, Daniel Dennett, contemporary philosopher of mind, one of the most famous living philosophers, has an excellent book on the topic, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Evolution and the Meanings of Life, which does a really, really good job of accessibly presenting the philosophical significance of Darwin. All right, that's it for today. So what I've tried to do here is just, first of all, explain in great detail and formally what an analogical argument is. I want to remind you, these are all inductive arguments. As I tried to point out throughout this presentation, you can sometimes try to recast them as deductive arguments, as categorical syllogisms. You can sometimes try to recast them as arguments using enumerative induction. But there is a reason that we often don't do that. We use analogies when we don't necessarily have clear guidance. We don't necessarily have a large sample size, or we aren't able to make a universal claim about all members of a class. But we are familiar with something and less familiar with something else, and we notice they're similar. We draw analogies. So these are inductive arguments. At best, then, they make their conclusions likely, never necessary. And that's just something to be aware of. I mean, the old saying is, when you can do better than an analogy, don't use an analogy. But we often can't, especially in morality and law. So in moral reason and legal reasoning and certain kinds of philosophical reasoning, like thinking about whether the universe has a creator or whether we have free will, these problems are pretty intractable. Analogies are really helpful. They're also super helpful in medicine. Will this household medication be useful for curing this disease that we hadn't thought about? So a number of years ago, for example, doctors started to realize that small doses of aspirin don't just help relieve pain or fevers, they also are useful for preventing strokes. The way that they came to that conclusion was essentially analogical reasoning. So you use this in medicine too. So that's what an analogical argument is. Now, the other side of this is learning how to criticize analogical arguments. And the big takeaway for today is I am imploring you, if you think an analogical argument is weak, please carefully show your work. It is not sufficient to say the two analogs are different from each other. That is poor reasoning. It's just intellectually lazy. You can do better than that. What you need to do is you need to think about those 6 tests. And you need to show why, first of all, and I emphasize 3. If the two analogs are different, first thing you can do is you can show that the properties in the primary analog are not, they don't necessarily go together with one another. They're not necessarily relevantly similar. Secondly, you can point out relevant disanalogies, right? So you can try to think about some kind of really significant difference that undermines the basis for comparison. Think back to that car example, the car accident versus capital punishment example. The relevant disanalogy there had to do with the difference between intentional and unintentional killing. And there was a larger point to be told, which is that intentional killings are morally different from unintentional killings. There's a difference between involuntary negligent manslaughter and premeditated murder. So if you want to refute an analogy, an analogical argument, one way to do so is to try to think about the underlying principle of comparison and show why it doesn't hold, because there's some significant difference. The third test was the test of specificity or generality. And in that case, what I said to you is analogical arguments often only succeed at proving something very general, vague, and vapid. Poorly constructed analogical arguments, though, often seem persuasive. And the reason they do is because the arguer has a more specific conclusion in mind that they are not telling you. So, for example, in the third example I used today, because I also talked about Justice Black's dissent in Katz versus United States. But the third example I used today was the design argument as discussed in Hume. And we saw that the problem with Cleanthes' argument is that Cleanthes wants to be arguing for the existence of God, the Christian God, the one God, perfect. And as Philo points out, the argument only proves that there is a designer, but doesn't say anything about the nature of the designer. It does not prove that the designer is perfect, immortal, all-powerful, and so on. Or eternal, I should say, not immortal. So there you have it. This is our coverage of analogical reasoning today, and I cannot stress how important this class is enough. Every time I teach this class, I notice that some students think, why are we spending so much time doing this? This is so obvious and so easy. Well, the reason is because a lot of what you will be doing in the projects from here on out will involve analogical reasoning, whether you recognize it or not, and it's very easy to do a poor job of reasoning analogically. Now, as I said, reasonable people may disagree about whether an argument is strong or not, whether an analogical argument is strong or not. All I ask from you is that you show your work. You back up your position. You don't have to agree with me. I don't have to agree with you. You don't have to agree with your classmates. But you have to back up your claims one way or another. Okay, that's it for today.